Let's dive into Express. What is Express.JS? If we go back to the Node.js documentation, you'll remember there's this quick start on how to build a basic web server using Node.js. And using these like 14 lines, we can start building our first web server and serving HTML content or even other type of content such as JSON or even images, JavaScript files, and so forth. Now, the Node.js HTTP module or HTTPS for production, we always use the secure version for production, is relatively low level. So it's just a basic functionality to help us accept requests from the network and respond with certain like content. If you start building a full-fledged web application that does quite a lot, well, it turns out that using the HTTP module is quite hard for you to create all the endpoints that are needed, handle like post requests, like handle uploads, handle all the stuff that you really need to implement in a basic full stack application. So the native Node.js HTTP or HTTPS module is quite hard for real applications. So we tend to use a framework or a library to make our lives easier and be able to handle such like complex applications. So this is where Express.js comes into play. Express.js, as you can see, it's a self-described, fast, unopinionated, minimalist web framework for Node.js. It's built on top of Node.js HTTP module, and it gives you like a syntax that helps you build web applications by easily implementing the stuff that you need for such an application. And it provides a syntax and some really helpful abstractions so that you can work and build web applications in a really easy way to deal with. You can see even just right from the start, a very basic hello world for Express is much smaller than the actual Node.js app. And the cool thing is that the minimalist doesn't only apply to like the syntax and the way that we run the code, we write the code, but it's also about how lightweight it is. So by default, Express.js gives you just the very basic abstractions that you need in order to set up a web server, start accepting requests and responding with different responses. And on top of that, you can add additional plugins or extensions if and only if you need these extensions. So by default, it gives you just the basics, like setup for a basic web server. And if you need some extra stuff, like if you need to handle forms, for example, you just add a plugin or an Express extension and you have this functionality included. We'll start by creating a very basic Express app. I'm going to switch over to my terminal. I have VS Code here, and I'm going to create a file called servers.js and copy and paste the hello world of Express. For starting, of course, I will have to initialize an npm project on my folder. So I'm going to run npm init-y to create a basic package.json and be ready to start my project. So I have a very basic package.json, and I'm going to be needing the Express framework. So after npm init, I'm going to run npm install or npm I for short Express, so that I download and install this framework, this npm module. And right after this installation, we have like our Express installed under Node modules with some other dependencies that Express needs. And if I run now my script, I have, and it's nice to have like an npm run start script. So I can use node server, and instead of typing node server, I can type node npm run start, or I can just have a watch. I would add a watch script to use the dash watch, which basically let node watch the changes on the files and then restart if there are some changes. So I'm going to use watch, or I will name it dev. This is what we usually use during development, and I'm going to run npm run dev. So the server is listening on port 3000. I will just add an extra information in here to make it easy for me to click through the terminal and open up the URL. So I'm going to say HTTP localhost port. So I can see like the full link, and I can control click or command click on Mac and open this up in the browser. And I can see my hello world in the browser. So my first Express app is up and running. I will open this app in the internal browser so let's see what's happening in here and what's different from the normal, like let's say Node.js HTTP app. So first of all, we use the common JS module. So we use require to load the Express module. Express is a function. So what we import from the Express module is a function that we next execute. And what this Express function gives us back is kind of like a special object that we store in a variable app. So Express initializes a new application and lets us do stuff by using the app variable. Of course, the app, we can name it anything we want, just a variable name. And then we start using the app as an object. So you can see app is an object because we use the .get method, the .listen, and basically that's like what Express gives us, an object with a bunch of functions that we can use, we can execute in order to do things with this server. We initialize a port with the number that's high enough for us to run without special permission. So by default, the example has port 3000, and then we start executing. So we use app, and for every single route, for every single path that we need to accept, we need to serve from the browser. Like if we want to serve protocol, domain, port, and then this path. So when the user like hits this very simple kind of like homepage URL, we say, I want our app to handle a GET request. So this means handle an HTTP GET request at URL path slash. So this is what this gets decoded to. If the user makes an HTTP GET request, so if the user opens up their browser and hits domain slash, that's a simple HTTP GET request. That's what the browser does when we open up and type an address. So we want our application, our web application, to handle these GET requests. So that's the .get, and this is the path. So if the user types slash here, or we can omit it, we will serve them this content. So this is the first path, the first part, which is about handling a certain path using a certain HTTP method. And the second argument to the app.get is a function, a callback function that accepts two parameters. And what's really useful to us is the second one, which corresponds to the response. So I will name this request and response, or request for short. And these are in exactly the same manner that Node HTTP module gives us this request and response object. These are two objects that contain information about the user request and information about, or an object that helps us build the response. The simplest thing that we can do with the response object is to use the .send method and send back a response. If I type anything in here, I can see the result in the page. And that's an HTML page. If I open up the dev tools and I check the network, you will see that this response, so the response headers come back by default with a content type set to text HTML, that's the MIME type, and a special character set encoding, which is what we see in most websites out there. So you can see straight away from the first like hello world example, Express goes one step further from the kind of like standard Node.js HTTP module, and by default gives us content type that is set for a particular type, which is the HTML. In Node HTTP, we have to manually set the content type so that the browser knows how to handle this response. So straight away, Express abstracts some of the parts that we had to write manually, explicitly in Node HTTP module, and we get our first HTML page with a single line of code. Now, if I type something in here like path or, I don't know, gallery, you can see that automatically, even without explicitly like writing any code, Express automatically gives me back a response which says, sorry, I couldn't find this slash gallery. I don't have any code that responds to this request. So we get this rather helpful message that something went wrong. The server is not ready to serve this content. So that would mean also that in Node HTTP, we had to write some code that would have some kind of like an if-else statement and serve the hello world in the case of the slash, like the home route, and then an else statement that would give us back some response that would say, what you send me through the URL, it's not available, so we would have to write this explicitly. So you can see there's some hidden gems running under the hood of Express. There's some really nice features built in, which helps us build a service that doesn't result in some not very helpful output for the user. And all this with just a few lines of code. Not only that, not only the user can see the actual message that help them understand that there's something missing here, but you can see here that automatically Express sets the status code for this response to 404 in the network panel. This response has automatically set the status code to 404. So instead of the 200 that we get in the successful home route, we automatically get a correct like 404 status code. So all these things would have to be manually configured and coded in HTTP module. The code that we see at the bottom is very similar to the Node app. In the Node server, we have the server and we start listening on a specific port and optionally on a specific hostname, and we get a callback that runs a function when the server starts listening. In Express, it's almost exactly the same. We provide the port, the server knows automatically how the hostname that we're currently using, so there's no need to provide the hostname, and a callback that acts in exactly the same way as the Node HTTP listen callback, a message or something that helps us see that the server is running. Now, let's explore some of the other options. What if we really wanted to serve a different content when the user typed, let's say, gallery? So instead of a 404, we get something in here. Now, this is a GET request to the /gallery path. So the only thing we need to do in here is use app with the .get and with the path. So for every single path, you just use app dot and the particular HTTP method. Most of the times, this would be like get the path name as a string and then a request response callback. So that's kind of like the basic syntax. So get path and then a res callback. And it's relatively easy syntax to remember and very easy to implement. So now if I hit refresh, I will not get a 404, but in order to conclude this new path, I will have to respond with something like, let's make this a, I don't know, some kind of like silly HTML. So I type some string that kind of like will serve in a very basic HTML. Now, when I hit refresh, I will no longer get a 404. I would get the content, the HTML content with a 200 status and a content type of text HTML, and of course this content. So you can see how easy it is to set up a website, and I can add like a very special, let's say, navigation to these pages. So I will say on the home page, I will send like h1 home. Let me make this simple, okay, just for now. So home and gallery, and home would be slash, and gallery would be /gallery. Put this also on the other page. So now if I refresh, I will see these two links on the gallery page. I can go to the home, I can see the navigation, so home or gallery. It's relatively easy to build a website with multiple web pages. This is how Express helps you do this. It's really, really cool. Now in here, if you have spotted a repeating pattern, you're already in the developer mindset. So this breaks the rule, the dry rule, that don't repeat yourself. I see kind of like the same content in two pages. And if I add another page, I would have to, let's say, update this as well. And not only that, but so another page, but I now have to update. So not only am I repeating myself with the navigation once, twice, thrice here, but I have to update the navigation 3 times. Now that I have a new route, I have to go here and copy and paste, miss something or mistype something. So that's why the dry rule is important to remember. And in order to make this better, in order to stop repeating myself, I can take this navigation, I can store it in one place. I can say here, instead I will place it in a string, in a variable, so I can update it once, and then it gets automatically repeated in all these places. So in here, I will say just display the contents of the menu variable. So I stop repeating myself, and I will have to put the menu in the same place. So stop repeating myself, and I get now 3 pages with 3 routes, 3 pages with a menu home, gallery, contact, and I can test that, they can all go from one page to another. So pretty cool that you can set this up in such an easy way in so few lines in Express.js. And the next time I add a new route, so if I say an about us page, I just change the title and I have to go and change the menu once. So instead of updating the code here and here and here and here manually as before, I just go in one place and update this in this menu. And hopefully I will see the about page and I can go to the contact, then I can go to the home, about, and I have my basic website structure set up. Now, the only thing that remains for me is to just think about what content I need to serve, what kind of like HTML pages I need to serve, and start just digging into the HTML creation process. So that's how Express helps us build these routes and build these websites and these web applications in a very, very easy manner. Just define the endpoints with this app.get, and for different paths, you provide a different callback function that's responsible for sending a response to the user. And you can see how nice it is to structure a web application like this. If your application grows and you have like content that spans like many lines and maybe your request response callbacks are rather large, you can start splitting this into different files. So maybe in here I can create like a folder, like components, and then I can put, for example, the menu in a file outside of the main app. So I can create a file called menu.js, and I can use the module exports. So we're in the common JS, so I have to use the module.exports to export this variable. And then I can keep this file clean, and I can say menu equals require components and menu. So now I just import the menu. Let me see if this works. No, it's undefined. Say yes, components, module exports. So I have this is sort of works like a default export, so I don't need the, let's see if this works, about everything. So now I can split my layout into different parts, like the menu or maybe the header or the footer, and I can store them in a different file and folder and just import them like this. So now this is cleaner and well structured. I can go even one step further and move maybe all this part or maybe the callbacks in a different file. So I can go into a folder called pages and then create a maybe home.js and move the callback function part into that page. I can move all of this, but for now, just to make it easier, I'm going to create a function in here. So I'm going to store this callback function in a variable, export it, so I can import it in the server, and this code can be moved in a different file and folder and have everything structured so I can easily find them, and also keep my server code like smaller. I'm going to say home equals require pages home, and then just replace this with home. And if I do this for all the routes, I will have just 4 lines of code. All the code that's related to these different pages will be split and structured in a way that's found in another folder. So I keep my server callback file to a minimum. Now, let me see whether it works. I get a reference error in the file called home.js on line 3. So that's because when I use this, when I call this function, you can see that menu is not defined. So I'm using a variable menu which is not found or not declared in this module. So I need to import this. I have to go to the parent folder, to the components, and import the menu. Let me see. Now it works, and I can do exactly the same thing with the other paths. And what I will end up getting is something like this. Right. So you'll get a cleaner, much smaller server.js, which acts up like a basic setup of your routes, your paths, and the corresponding controllers code that actually serves the content, and you'll have like fewer lines in here. So whenever you want to just work on the gallery, you open up the gallery page. Whenever you work on the home, you go on the home instead of having all this code in here. So that's kind of like one way that we can set up and structure and clean up our server.js and have a better structure app so we can work with in the future. All this happens because Express.js gives us this really nice syntax that helps us manage this complexity in a really nice, cool way. I will go into the contact page and create a simple form. Just a simple form, plain HTML form, no JavaScript in here, where I'm going to be letting the user just type in a comment, click the send comment, and send us back some response. I'm going to hard code the value here just for testing now. So we can just get the thing ready. And now if I send this, if I click this, remember this is a plain raw HTML form, which means the browser and HTML is going to handle this form submission. What this is going to do is going to pick up the form elements that have a name attribute, grab the values, and try to send them to a website that is defined in the action attribute here. So if I say just send all this to the /contact, what is going to happen is the form is going to submit the content to this /contact, but instead of, or let me just toggle the developer tools and see. So we have this contact, and if I send the comment, you will see that there's a refresh. There's a very short refresh that we maybe didn't actually see, but it grabs all the input element, name and value. So you can see the name and the value, and it does a GET request. Anyway, this is a GET request. Yeah, it's a GET request. Okay. And I send this to exactly the same page. If I change this info, let me go back to the contact. Now, if I click submit, the form will submit this content to the /info. It will try to send this to the /info. But what I will get back there is a 404. Because there's no endpoint set in here to handle the request. So in order for the form to submit this content to the page /info, I have to create this, respond with some. So I'll go back here. So now I have created an endpoint that receives the data from the browser when the browser sends this information to the /info. So now the form will submit the data to /info, which is going to result in a request at this endpoint and a response back. So let me send. So I started by loading this page, submitting, getting this information to be submitted to the /info, and I get the app.get actually doing stuff with the data. Now, in this page, I get to see the form contents as a query parameter. So everything is included in the URL. And the way that I can see this in my server, I can console log. First, I will console log the rec, is the request object. And let me open up the console here to see actually what the request object contains when the user submits something. I will once again go to the contact, send, I land on the /info, I get the response, but in the server side, I can see like something that contains lots and lots of information. So the request object is huge. It contains all the information that we got back from the client side. And in here, what I'm looking is this like query, which contains the data from the form. There's some other information that's, some of this is like really not very useful at this point or really hard to read. But basically what I can do is I can use an option. Let me go to the Express.js documentation, by the way, which is actually pretty nice. So once you are on the expressjs.com site, you go to the API reference. We're using the latest version, which is 5. We have like different sections about the response, the request, the application. I will go to the request and then try to find the query parameter. So I have this rec.query, which basically allows me to parse the query parameters that are passed from the user, this question mark, comment, blah, blah, blah. So I go to the info and type rec query right now and I submit the form, I get the data that was submitted as an object. So everything that was submitted in here as a query parameter, so the key value pair. So this thing here becomes, so this is the client and the server gives me back a nice object syntax. So I'm in JavaScript, so I need to use JavaScript structures, entities like object. The URL is encoded, is not very user-friendly. So the rec.query just grabs the contents of the submitted form and gives me back this object. And I can say, if I know the input form values, I can say query.comment. So I get the value. And if I add another input form field, I can go in here and I can say, and now I have like two input elements. I'm also going to supply a hard-coded value. Usually in production, you don't have these values, right? You let the user supply the value just for the testing here. So now I'm going to be sending two input form values. So when I submit, you will see that the query parameters will include two key value pairs. So these key value pairs are turned into this object. So it's pretty easy to create forms and then submit and receive the data as an object. So in here, this case, so when the client form sends this encoded form, the server has a much nicer object structure. So now I can say rec.query.country. All these properties are available through the query object, and I get to see my comment and the country. So it's pretty cool because your form now can submit data, user data to the server, and the server can respond by parsing and manipulating and processing this data. So in this case, I'm going to give you a nice example. I'm going to let the user supply a comment, but also a country name, which I'm going to use and give back some information about the country. Let's stick with the country population. So I'm going to have a database of countries. I'm going to make it lowercase, and I'm going to add some numbers here. So I'm going to find some statistics. So new tab. Let's find a Greece population, and I'm going to copy this in here. I'm going to use the nice JavaScript formatting using the numeric format with the underscore. And then let's say I'm going to put it in here. And now when I receive the input from the user, depending on the country, I'm going to use the country name. I'm going to store it in a variable, make it lowercase, or I can, let's say, just put it in here directly, whatever suits you. So grabbing this data from the user submitted form, turning it into lowercase. It doesn't matter if the user typed Greece or Greece or Greece. And then I can use the object as a dictionary, and I can say population is country DB, and then supply the country as a key. So if the country key is Greece, it will find this property, object property entry, and it will give me back this value. If the key submitted is Ukraine, it will find Ukraine, give me the population. And if the result is undefined, because that can be the case for a country that is not included in my database, I will have to send back a different response. So in this case, I'm going to say, so submitting the form, submitting the country name, grabbing the population for our small country database, and then sending back a response. And I can say here, the population of the submitted country of rec query country. I need the full, let's say, uppercase, lowercase name is, and I type in the name here. I submit, and I get the population of Greece. If I go and type Ukraine, I get the results. I can even type like this. So it works in all case-insensitive ways. And if I type something that isn't included yet in my database, I will get country not found in our database. So you can see with just a few lines of code and with some really cool built-in capabilities of Express. So just grabbing the query string from submitted data, we can actually build some really nice functionality. So here's a website that we can use to get some information, some, let's say, question or some query from the user or a keyword, and then search through some database and provide some details about a specific country. If I take away the comments, this code that handles these requests and gives us back some country data is just a few lines of code, and that's why, and that's how Express helps us build these web applications relatively easy. If you want to go a step further and, let's say, implement a much nicer kind of application for country information, you can of course use some HTML to make this more pretty. So we can have an H1 here. And you get to see something much nicer. Maybe even use a style. I wouldn't normally do this inline, but for now, color scheme, dark. And you can style it any way you like. For this app, I will share a link with you. The website, it's called REST Countries. So there's a website that keeps lots and lots of information about all of the countries in the world in a simple JSON file. So you can find a big file here. It's called countries version 2 JSON. So this is a huge JSON file. Let me see if I can view. Okay, this is a JSON. It's not readable this way, but basically it contains all the countries of the world and contains things like the language. So for example, the first country is Afghanistan, and let's see, population. So somewhere I think and it's kind of an object where it contains many useful information about the country, like the code, the borders, like the codes of countries that are bordering to. This is Afghanistan, the area, square kilometers, I think, the capital, the name, currencies. There's also a URL that points to the flag of the country. You can grab some information and you can make this application provide not just the population, but also the capital. Would be nice to have here something like the capital is, and the official language is something like this. So it would be really cool to make this provide more information. Or you can just switch from country information to any kind of information that you'd like to provide, like any kind of service that you're thinking of implementing. On top of the get method, which handles, all these get, HTTP get about us, the /info, contact. We can also handle all the other HTTP verbs. So if you want to handle HTTP post data, so if there's a form with method post, so by default, the form will submit the data through an HTTP GET method. But if you change this to method post and action, let's say data, then the form will submit the data, the input fields, through a post request. And in order to handle this post request, you say app.post. So all the HTTP methods are available through this app. So you have handle HTTP delete data and so forth. What else? We have put. Okay, so you can handle also other HTTP verbs. With Node.js HTTP module, you have to do this manually. You have to check the request, see whether the method was a delete or a put or a post or a get, and then create some very messy conditional or switch statements and add to handle this yourself. But Express gives us this really nice syntax, and it's so easy to handle all these endpoints. And that's I think, a very basic introduction to Express.